United States is witnessing an unusual escalation in federal political and legal conflict as the U.S. Justice Department opens a criminal investigation into two prominent Minnesota political leaders, Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, raising complex questions about federal authority, local leadership, freedom of speech, and the administration's enforcement of immigration policy. What makes this situation remarkable is not only the substantive allegations being examined, but also the broader backdrop in which they have emerged, marked by intense local unrest in Minneapolis, high-profile federal immigration operations, and direct presidential involvement in domestic law enforcement matters. These events underscore deep divisions in American politics and highlight the fraught relationship between state and federal governments when policy disagreements escalate into legal scrutiny. The Washington Post +1. The investigation announced by the Department of Justice centers on whether Governor Walz and Mayor Frey may have conspired to impede or obstruct the work of federal immigration agents by way of their public statements and actions. According to U.S. officials familiar with the probe, the inquiry focuses on a specific federal statute, commonly associated with conspiracy to injure or impede officers of the United States. This represents a notable legal escalation, as it moves beyond ordinary political rhetoric to potential criminal liability for political leaders whose offices routinely engage in public policy discourse. Axios. The context for this legal action originates in a broader set of intense federal immigration enforcement operations launched in Minneapolis and surrounding areas. Under orders from President Donald Trump, thousands of Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) and U.S. Border Patrol agents were deployed to the region as part of what federal officials describe as a major crackdown on undocumented immigration and gang activity. The unprecedented scale of this deployment, described by the Department of Homeland Security as one of its largest operations, provoked immediate tensions with local authorities and community leaders, who argued that the federal presence was excessive and destabilizing. These tensions were further exacerbated by a highly controversial incident in which an ICE agent fatally shot a local resident, 37-year-old Renee Good, during an enforcement action. The shooting sparked explosive public reaction, with local leaders condemning the violence and calling for accountability. In the aftermath, Governor Walz and Mayor Frey both issued strong public statements criticizing the federal response and the implementation of immigration enforcement policies in their jurisdictions. Walz, a former Democratic candidate for national office, addressed the public directly via social media and other channels, urging residents to document any interactions with federal agents and encouraging peaceful protest against what he described as chaotic and dangerous conditions created by the federal surge. Reuters. Mayor Frey also emerged as a vocal critic of the federal operation, posting statements that underscored his deep dissatisfaction with the presence of ICE agents and the way the enforcement strategy was unfolding on the streets of Minneapolis. Frey's rhetoric, including explicit calls for federal officers to withdraw, drew national attention and polarized public opinion. To some supporters, he was defending local autonomy and public safety. To others, he was undermining federal law enforcement efforts and potentially encouraging resistance to legally sanctioned activities. Axios. It is this intersection of political criticism, public leadership, and law enforcement engagement that has drawn the Justice Department's scrutiny. Federal prosecutors are reportedly examining whether the public comments and policy positions articulated by Walz and Frey could meet the legal threshold for conspiracy to impede federal officers. This statute, seldom used in situations involving protected speech or policy disagreement, carries significant consequences if violations are established, prompting new debates about the boundaries of political expression for elected officials. The Washington Post. In practical terms, subpoenas have been prepared to compel testimony or document production from both Walz and Frey, although it was not immediately clear whether those subpoenas had been formally served at the time of reporting. The investigation has been described as without recent precedent, echoing legal actions against protesters or civilians in the past, but rarely brought against serving state governors or large city mayors whose objections are rooted in political disagreement. Legal experts note that while prosecutors have wide latitude to pursue allegations of obstruction, using federal criminal statutes against elected officials for their public statements is highly unusual and could have long-lasting implications for the relationship between policy criticism and criminal law. The Guardian. For their part, both Walz and Frey have fiercely rejected the premise of the investigation, framing it as political intimidation and a weaponization of the Justice Department against critics of the Trump administration's policies. Walz, who has held leadership roles in the Democratic Party for years and served as a member of Congress before becoming governor, issued statements characterizing the probe as an authoritarian tactic aimed at silencing dissent. He drew comparisons to the investigation of other prominent figures and underscored the importance of protecting political speech and civic leadership from criminalization. Frey, echoing similar sentiments, said that the investigation was an attempt to intimidate him for defending the safety and interests of Minneapolis residents. His office emphasized that the focus of his leadership has consistently been on public safety, peaceful protest, and constructive engagement with federal authorities, even as he has pushed back against policies he deems harmful to the city's communities. Frey's stance highlights the deep political divide underpinning the situation. Whether criticism of federal policy constitutes legitimate political speech or crosses into unlawful interference with law enforcement activity. The Guardian. The political reaction to the DOJ's announcement has been sharply divided. Republicans and supporters of the Trump administration view the investigation as a lawful assertion of federal authority, a necessary check on state and local leaders whose rhetoric may have contributed to rising tensions and civil unrest. To this perspective, ensuring that federal law enforcement officers can carry out their mandated duties without obstruction is essential to maintaining order and upholding federal policies, regardless of local political disagreements. Axios. Critics of the investigation, including legal scholars, civil liberties advocates, and many Democratic elected officials, warn that using criminal law to target political speech and public policy disagreement sets a dangerous precedent. They argue that elected leaders must be able to voice opposition to federal practices without fear of legal retribution, emphasizing the importance of robust political debate in a democratic society. This argument draws on the First Amendment protections afforded to speech, particularly when exercised by public officials in their official capacity. The potential chilling effect on political expression and leadership advocacy is seen as a serious concern, one that strikes at the heart of American constitutional norms. The Guardian. Meanwhile, public reaction extends beyond Minnesota and the local political sphere. National media outlets have treated the investigation as emblematic of broader tensions within the United States, between federal authority and state autonomy. Analysts note that the clash reflects deeper ideological divisions over immigration policy, a topic that has been politically contentious for years and remains a central issue in U.S. national politics. The intersecting pressures of enforcement, civil liberties, and public dissent are playing out in Minneapolis as a microcosm of the country's polarized landscape. Complicating matters further is the role of President Trump himself, whose public statements have at times escalated the situation. According to multiple reports, Trump has floated the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act, a rarely used federal statute that allows the president to deploy active military forces domestically to suppress civil unrest. The mere suggestion of such a move, even if not immediately enacted, has further intensified tensions between Trump's administration and local Minneapolis leaders. Axios. The backdrop to this confrontation includes ongoing protests and demonstrations that began in the wake of the fatal shooting of Renee Good. Good's death has become a focal point for public dissatisfaction with federal immigration enforcement. galvanizing local communities and drawing national attention to policing practices. The protests have frequently been large, impassioned, and at times confrontational, with law enforcement and demonstrators at odds over the appropriate balance of authority, protest rights, and public safety protocols. AP News. Within the legal community, opinions vary on the likelihood of successful prosecution under the conspiracy statute being cited by the DOJ. Some experts argue that mere public criticism should not meet the legal standard for obstruction, which typically requires demonstrable actions aimed at physically preventing officers from performing their duties. Others caution that if prosecutors can show that statements were intended to encourage or support actions that disrupted enforcement efforts, the legal framework for charges could be strengthened. Regardless of outcome, the very existence of the investigation casts a long shadow over public discourse and political leadership behavior. The political implications of the inquiry also extend to the 2026 election cycle, which is already shaping up to be contentious. Leaders like Walz and Frey, both with national profiles, find themselves at the center of a narrative that could influence voter sentiment and party strategies. For Democrats, the investigation may energize advocacy around civil liberties and opposition to federal intrusion. For Republicans, it may reinforce themes of law and order and support for robust federal enforcement of immigration laws. The judicial probe, therefore, is not merely a legal matter, but also a developing political flashpoint. Another layer in this unfolding saga is the broader question of federalism, the constitutional balance of power between state governments and the federal government. American history is filled with episodes of friction between state and federal authorities, from civil rights enforcement in the 1960s to disagreements over drug policy in recent decades. What distinguishes the current situation is the intersection of immigration enforcement, criminal investigations of sitting elected officials, and direct presidential engagement in domestic policy enforcement. This combination underscores the complexity and potential long-term implications of the case. Reuters. Amid these developments, local communities in Minnesota continue to grapple with the human reality of the situation. Ordinary citizens, from families of protesters to small business owners and workers, find themselves navigating the consequences of federal enforcement actions, public demonstrations, and political posturing. The social texture of Minneapolis and its surrounding areas reflects a city under stress, where debates over public safety, community rights, and government authority are playing out in everyday life. AP News. Moreover, the legal proceedings themselves, whether they result in formal charges, subpoenas, or potential courtroom battles, will be watched closely by constitutional scholars and political observers across the nation. The outcome of these actions could set precedents regarding the extent to which elected officials can voice dissent against federal policies without facing criminal consequences. It could also influence future interactions between local and federal authorities in times of policy conflict. The Washington Post. As the investigation progresses, both supporters and critics of the DOJ's actions are likely to remain deeply engaged. For supporters, the inquiry represents accountability for political leadership in resisting federal directives. For critics, it symbolizes an overreach of federal power into the realm of political speech. The ongoing legal and political struggle will continue to define the relationship between state leaders and the federal government, and will be an important chapter in the broader story of American governance in the early 21st century. The Guardian. In the end, the events unfolding in Minnesota, Washington, D.C., and beyond highlight the complex and often contentious nature of law, politics, and civil rights in a deeply polarized society. Whether this investigation resolves quickly or becomes a prolonged legal battle, its significance extends far beyond the immediate players involved, touching on fundamental questions about the role of opposition, criticism, and enforcement in a democratic republic. The Washington Post.